The bell begins before dawn. A low iron throat groaning across frost-bound fields, the sound traveling not with urgency but with patience, the patience of something that knows it will be heard eventually. It does not ring in celebration. It tolls once, then again, the vibration shivering through timbered walls and thatched roofs beaded with dew, pressing through the sleeping bodies of those who have learned to count the tolls before they are fully awake. They hold their breath for a third, as if by listening close enough they might catch fate deciding. Smoke rises thin and uncertain from hearth holes, carrying the sour scent of damp wood and barley porridge. Somewhere beyond the palisade, a cartwheel grinds against frozen mud. A crow startles into the pale sky and does not return. The village of St. Allard once woke to the rhythm of labor. Women kneading maslin bread before first light, their arms white to the elbow with rye flour, the loaves forming under their hands like small promises. Men driving oxen to strip fields of their final turnips, their breath hanging in the cold like the ghosts of words not yet spoken. Children chasing geese from the common well, their laughter thin as birdsong over the frost. This is how a village breathes, through its people, through the repetition of need, through the ordinary gravity of morning after morning of the same morning. But now the doors remain barred long after sunrise. A scrap of red cloth hangs from one lintel, a warning and a confession all at once. Inside, rushes rot on earthen floors, and the air is heavy with vinegar, rosemary, and fear. The priest has instructed them to burn juniper and carry pomanders of clove and ambergris, as though scent might bargain with death, as though death had a nose, and could be softened. It began with the miller's son. He returned from Rouen in October with a cough that would not loosen, a wet, rattling thing that seemed less like sickness and more like something he had brought back with him, folded inside his cloak, tucked among his belongings like a terrible souvenir. Within days, his neck bore the swellings. Buboes like bruised plums beneath the skin, tender at first, then hard and black and enormous, as though his own body had turned against him from the inside out. The barber surgeon came with his brass basin and leeches, muttering Latin learned from a cracked manuscript of Galen, his voice low and ceremonial, the way men recite prayers when prayer is all that is left. He lanced what he could. The boy screamed until his voice thinned to a whisper, and by vespers he was still. The village crossed itself and moved on. Then it was the fuller's wife. Then the bailiff's daughter. Then the two brothers who shared a house at the eastern edge of the common, found cold beside each other one Tuesday morning as though they had simply agreed to sleep and not wake. And now the graveyard soil is soft despite the cold, unusually soft, people murmur, the kind of softness that doesn't entirely make sense, as though the earth beneath St. Allard has been waiting for this, as though it had been quietly preparing room. The gravediggers wrap their faces in linen soaked with wine. They no longer carve names into the wooden markers. There is not enough time for names anymore. They dig trenches instead, long, narrow corridors of turned earth, and those who loved the ones placed inside them must find their grief in the shape of a trench rather than the intimacy of a marker bearing letters. The reeve counts the dead with trembling fingers, his ink bleeding across the parchment roll of tenants who owe rent they will never now pay. Each crossed name is not merely a death, it is a gap in the harvest, a gap in the tithe, a gap in the fragile arithmetic of survival by which a village measures its own life. The Lord's steward has not returned since Candlemas. Even the pigeons have abandoned the dovecot, their emptied perches pale with old droppings, the hole in the tower wall gaping at the sky like an open mouth. They ask God why, and the silence that returns is absolute. The priest, Father Alberic, moves through the village each day wrapped in his long dark habit, his face closed and careful, a man who has learned that certainty is more useful than truth in a time like this. He tells them it is God's correction, a chastisement of the proud, the fornicating, the Sabbath breakers. He gives them penance and prayers. He gives them formulas to repeat after dark. But his own eyes have grown hollow over these past weeks, and the villagers have noticed, in the way that frightened people notice everything, that Father Alberic no longer visits the dying. That he gives last rites now through a cracked door, his voice reaching in from the threshold like a hand that will not commit to the touch. They do not blame him. They understand. Fear is not a sin, no matter how the sermons describe it. At night, The villagers lie awake and listen for their own breath, measuring its rhythm against the silence with a new and terrible attention. Every pause between inhalations becomes an abyss. Every twitch of a limb, every ache in the jaw or neck, every tiredness that isn't quite ordinary tiredness. Each of these is a door that could be opening. The bell rope sways gently in the tower, as if touched by unseen hands. The fire in the hearth throws orange shadows across the wall, and in those shadows, the living press their children closer and remember how ordinary warmth felt before it became something to be grateful for. And yet, there is a woman on the edge of the village, a widow named Cecily, who rises before the bell and has not stopped rising. Each morning she opens her door and steps out into the gray pre-dawn and draws water from the well and sets it to boil and brings it, quietly, to the houses that have no one left to draw it. She does not speak much. She does not offer comfort in words. She offers broth and water and the sound of footsteps outside a barred door. The sound of someone who has not abandoned you. No one knows what compels her. She has lost a son herself. She has reason enough to bar her own door and disappear into mourning. But she does not. She moves through the village like a counter-argument. It is a small resistance, and it may not matter. The plague does not negotiate with small resistances. The plague does not see Cecily's broth, or the grief that propels her through the frost each morning, or the 100 small dignities she preserves simply by continuing to treat the living as though they are still worth tending. But something does see it. Perhaps only we, watching across the distance of centuries, from the safety of our own unknowing. And that watching, that witnessing across time, is its own kind of survival. The survival of the story, the survival of the deed, the insistence that what happened here among these frost-stung fields and barred doors and soft graveyard soil was not merely suffering, but also this. A woman rising before the bell, carrying water. The village leans towards something vast and merciless. The earth beneath their feet has begun, very quietly, to open. But not everyone has stopped standing on it. The cart stands abandoned beside the well, its shafts resting in the dust like broken arms that have forgotten what they once carried. No one moved it. No one thought to. In a village where every object once had its purpose and its person, this cart belonging to the fuller, these shafts worn smooth by the fuller's hands over 20 years of market mornings. The abandonment of a cart is not a small thing. It is a confession. It means the fuller is gone, or too weak to rise, or simply past the point of caring whether the cart remains in the road or not. The bucket rope hangs slack beside it, creaking whenever the wind shifts, a dry rhythmic sound like something being slowly counted down. Water glimmers in the well, untouched, reflecting a sky the color of old pewter. Flies gather where they should not gather this early in spring. And the road that runs from the mill to the chapel and back again, once churned to mud each morning by the weight of hooves and boots and barrows, lies still. This is how a village disappears. Not in fire. Not in conquest. In stillness. In the cottage nearest the chapel, a young woman named Isabeau kneels beside her mother's pallet. She has been kneeling for 3 days, with intervals only to boil water and press cloth and refill the small earthen bowl she keeps by the bedside with whatever will stay cool. The straw mattress beneath her mother is dark with sweat, the ticking stained in rings like the marks left by floodwater on a stone wall, evidence of waves that have come and receded and come again. Isabeau presses a cloth steeped in cool water to the swollen gland beneath her mother's jaw, the skin there taut and terrible, hot as a bread stone fresh from the fire. She whispers prayers in a mixture of Latin and the soft Norman French of her childhood, the language her mother used for lullabies and scolding and the particular tenderness reserved for early mornings when the house was cold and the world had not yet begun to ask anything of them. She has heard the rumors that the sickness travels on breath, invisible and patient, riding the exhalations of the dying into the mouths of those who lean too close. That it clings to cloth, that a man may fall ill from touching the shirt of one already dead, the pestilence threaded into the weave like dye that will not wash out. That it seeps through skin, through the mere warmth of proximity, that love itself becomes a vector of transmission when love means staying near. The barber surgeon said as much before he stopped coming. The priest said as much before he started reading the rites from outside the door. Still, Isabeau does not move away. This is a choice that history does not always record. It does not appear in the chronicles of great lords or the accounts of papal legates traveling between capitals. But it is, in its own way, one of the most consequential choices a human being can make: to remain. To press the cloth again, even knowing. To keep the hand inside the hand and let the prayers come in whatever language they arrive, Latin or French or the older, wordless grammar of grief. Outside, the fields lie half-sown. Winter wheat struggles in uneven rows, the seedlings pale and sparse where the sowing was interrupted, the lines beginning to blur where weeds have moved in to fill the spaces the living left behind. The oxen wander unattended near the hedgerows, pulling at what grass remains, their great patient bodies indifferent to the crisis that has unmade their purpose. The village once paid its tithe in grain and eggs to the abbey 3 leagues distant, the yearly obligation a thread connecting the earthly and the sacred, a transaction by which the community understood itself to be in proper relationship with God. Now no one dares approach the abbey gates, though its stone tower rises firm and unchanged against the horizon, that indifferent permanence of stone, which neither sickens nor mourns nor closes its eyes to weep. The monks have shut their doors. Some say they sing psalms day and night, their voices rising behind those walls in an unbroken chain of devotion, as though continuous prayer might build a wall the pestilence cannot scale. Others say they have fallen silent, that the singing stopped 3 weeks ago, and since then the tower has exhaled only smoke and the occasional crow, and nobody knows what that silence means. The bailiff rides through once a week, a scarf tied over his mouth and nose, his horse kept always to the center of the road, a man maintaining the performance of authority while every instinct in him strains toward the horizon and whatever lies beyond it that is not this. He demands that rents be left in a wooden chest at the crossroads, coins placed in vinegar, he specifies, as though the vinegar might absorb whatever invisible malice clings to copper and silver. Fewer coins appear each time. The chest sits open in the wind, and the bailiff does not dismount to count what's there. He rides on. Even the machinery of obligation is learning to accommodate the end of things. The king's wars in Gascony feel very far away. Those concerns, territory, honor, the price of wool, the disputed claims of distant nobles, have not ceased to exist, but they have become inaudible beneath the closer, louder emergency of fever and breath and the question of whether mourning will bring diminishment or survival. The only battle is the one burning inside the body, waged between something invisible and everything a person has ever been. Isabeau hears the chapel bell toll again. She has begun to count the intervals between tolls without meaning to, the way one counts between lightning and thunder, measuring not distance but approach. She imagines the bell rope's fibers fraying with each pull, threads surrendering one by one to the tension, the rope growing thinner, the bell growing heavier with each ringing until one day there will be nothing left to hold the clapper to the sound. Her mother's breathing rattles like dry peas in a bowl, uneven, searching, each inhale a small effort of will, each exhale a partial surrender. On the hearth, a pot of pottage has gone cold and untouched. The smell of garlic and onions lingers in the low beams, mingling with the bitter tang of sickness, that particular smell, which those who have known it never mistake for anything else and never entirely forget. When her mother's hand slips from hers, Isabeau does not cry out. She has rehearsed this moment without knowing she was rehearsing it. The hand loosens. The rattling stops. The room becomes a different kind of room, not larger, but emptied of something that had weight without volume, the specific gravity of a presence that has been there since before you were born and therefore felt like a property of the world itself rather than a person inside it. Isabeau listens to the silence that follows. It is thick as wool, as the priest's vestments, as the walls of the abbey that may or may not still contain the living. Beyond the shuttered window, the village exhales, that collective, barely audible release that travels cottage to cottage whenever another flame gutters, as though the community shares a single lung and feels each diminishment in unison. She understands, kneeling there in the cold beside the still pallet, that she has crossed an invisible threshold. From daughter to survivor. From innocence to witness. She is 17 years old, and she has become someone who knows things that cannot be unknown, has seen the face that the world keeps hidden until it chooses not to. Outside, the cart still leans beside the well. The bucket rope still creaks. The water still glimmers in its dark circle, still and patient, holding the sky's reflection the way the living hold memory, clear enough and utterly alone. But Isabeau rises. And in the days that will follow, in the harder days, the days when even grief becomes a luxury the living cannot fully afford, it will matter enormously that she rose. That someone did. That when the silence finished falling, one person in Saint Allard stood up inside it and began to move. She does not know yet what she will do next. She does not know who else remains, which doors still have breath behind them, which fires still burn. She will have to walk out into the village and find out. She will have to look. That walk, through a door, into the gray morning light, into the knowledge of what a place looks like when it is being emptied of its people, is where we are going next. He washes his hands in wine before entering. It is a ritual he has invented himself, in the absence of any guidance that accounts for this. No canon, no pastoral letter, no document passed down from bishop to priest that describes what to do when the dying outnumber the living and the hours between last rites blur into a single unbroken officiation. The wine stains his fingers a faint purple as he rubs them together over the bowl, the color seeping into the creases of his knuckles like bruises that have decided to stay. He watches the liquid redden and does not pray. He has been praying without ceasing for 3 months and has begun to understand that prayer, at a certain depth of exhaustion, becomes indistinguishable from silence. Perhaps they are the same thing. Perhaps they always were. Father Matthew lifts the pyx from the small table beside the door and presses it against his chest. Inside, wrapped in linen embroidered with pale blue crosses, the consecrated host waits, the body of Christ, carried through a village of the dying, through air that smells of sickness and would smoke, and the vinegar people burn in doorways as though the plague might be an insect, easily repelled. The women who embroidered that linen are already buried. He knows their names. He buried them himself, in ground that grows less willing with each passing week, the earth receiving what it must but offering no comfort in the transaction. He pushes through the door. In 20 years of parish ministry, Father Matthew buried 41 souls. He has buried more than that since November alone. He keeps no count now. The counting became its own wound, each number a specific face, a specific name that his congregation once called across the common or sang in the choir or said aloud at the Christmas feast, and he found that carrying the precise arithmetic of loss was more than his mind could hold without breaking. So he stopped counting. He performs each rite with the full attention he can still muster, which is less than he once gave but more than nothing, and he tells himself that God understands the mathematics of diminishment better than he does. His voice is hoarse from chanting the office of the dead. The words of the requiem have worn grooves in his throat, the Latin syllables tumbling over one another now with a terrible fluency, prayers that once required concentration flowing out of him automatically, like water finding its course. He no longer waits for full confession. In the early weeks, he tried, sitting beside each pallet, listening with care for the weight of sin each person had carried, offering absolution with the gravity the sacrament deserves. But the dying cannot always speak. The dying wait for no pastoral schedule. And so he has learned to abbreviate, to compress the centuries of liturgical architecture into a few hurried whispers. Ego de absolvo. I absolve you. The syllables dropping into the hot air of the sickroom like stones into deep water, going down, and Father Matthew watching them go and not always certain what receives them at the bottom. Outside, the cemetery has no more room. He sanctioned the graves beyond the stone wall 2 weeks ago, in soil once reserved for grazing sheep, a decision that required no counsel, no correspondence with the diocese, nothing but the recognition that the alternative was worse. Beyond the wall is unconsecrated ground, technically, but he has prayed over every foot of it, walking the perimeter at dawn with holy water and a psalter, muttering the blessings in the gray light before anyone else was awake. Whether this transfers the grace he intends, whether the prayers of a single exhausted country priest are sufficient to consecrate muddy sheep pasture into a place God will recognize, this he does not know. He has added it to the long list of things he does not know, a list that has been growing since October and shows no sign of ending. The villagers watch him as though he carries answers in the folds of his cassock. Some kneel in the mud when they see him coming, reaching toward him with muddied hands, begging for relics, for holy water, for the specific reassurance that God has not turned his face away from Saint Allard, that this is not abandonment but trial, not punishment but purification, that somewhere in the architecture of divine intention there is a reason for what is happening that will eventually become visible, if only they endure long enough to see it. He gives what he can. He fills their small bottles from the holy water stoup, knowing the stoup is running low. He presses his thumb to foreheads and murmurs the formula of blessing, watching their eyes close in something between faith and desperate hope, the two having become very difficult to distinguish. Others avert their eyes when he passes. Suspicion coiling beneath grief like a second infection, slower moving but no less destructive. He hears the murmurs, carried on the same thin wind that carries smoke and the smell of turned earth, that the sickness is punishment for sin, not private sin, but collective, communal sin, the accumulated moral debt of a village that has been weighed and found wanting. He hears darker things too, echoes of rumors drifting in from larger towns, from the roads between cities where strangers carry news along with pestilence. Stories of wells poisoned in distant places. Of people sought out and punished for crimes they did not commit, fear requiring a shape it can name, a body it can strike, because striking something is more bearable than the alternative, which is to stand in the dark and understand that what is killing them has no face, no intention, no grievance to be addressed or satisfied. It simply moves. And the hardest truth Father Matthew carries, the one he cannot speak aloud from any pulpit, is that he cannot disprove these rumors with theology. He can only stand between them and what they would become, one tired man in a stained cassock, holding a line that grows thinner each week. In the rectory at night, he reads by candlelight. The psalter is worn soft with handling, its binding held together by a strip of leather he replaced himself 3 winters ago. Wax drips from the candle onto the table as he reads, forming pale stalactites that harden into small monuments to the hours he has sat here after the day's work of dying was finished. He finds himself returning again and again to the same passages, to the great dark poems of suffering and endurance, to the words about pestilence that walks in darkness and destruction that wastes at noonday. He mouths the words silently, tasting them, turning them over like river stones to see what they reveal beneath. He has read them his whole life. He thought he understood them. He understands now that he did not, that understanding requires experience of a particular kind, the kind that costs something, and that the Psalms were written by people who had paid that cost in full and written from the other side of it, which is perhaps why they have endured. He wonders whether faith is a shield or a lantern, whether what he carries into those dark cottages offers genuine protection against something, against despair, against the dissolution of meaning, against the specific terror of dying in a world that has stopped making sense, or whether it is simply a flame held up in a storm too vast to comprehend, illuminating nothing but the fact of its own burning. He does not resolve this question. He is not sure it can be resolved. He picks up the holy oil and goes back out. Each morning he visits the sick with dried sage and the vial of oil, the sage fragrant and green-smelling, almost aggressively alive in a season so saturated with dying. He anoints foreheads hot as forged stones, his thumb making the small cross that has been made over dying foreheads for 1,000 years, and sometimes he feels, underneath the heat of the fever, a flicker of something, not quite peace, but recognition, the body acknowledging the gesture, the ancient sacrament doing whatever ancient sacraments do in the moment between life and whatever comes after. Other times he feels nothing but the heat, and the roughness of skin, and the labor of his own breathing in the thick air. He has noticed the tremor in his own hands. He first noticed it 4 days ago, while filling the holy water bottle by the door. A slight unsteadiness, the bottle clicking against the stopper more times than it should. He told himself it was exhaustion, the accumulated weight of 3 months of interrupted sleep and inadequate bread, and the specific kind of tiredness that comes not from physical labor but from emotional expenditure without end. He has been telling himself this for 4 days. Each morning he takes inventory of his own body with the frightened attention of a man who has watched the same inventory completed on too many others, cataloging each sensation, each warmth or ache, each dryness in the throat. So far, The conclusion is inconclusive. He does not know whether he is dying or simply afraid. He understands that these can feel identical. One evening, as the sun drops blood-red behind the timbered roofline, turning the whole western sky the color of a wound beginning to close, Father Matthew pauses before pulling the bell rope. The air is perfectly still. No crow calls. The smoke from the hearth holes rises straight into the fading light, undisturbed, as though the world itself is holding its breath. He stands with the rope in his hands, the fibers rough and familiar against his sore palms, and for a long moment he simply stands. He has rung this bell for births and marriages and the deaths of the old and expected, for feast days and holy days and the ordinary Sundays of an ordinary life in an ordinary parish, and the bell has always meant the same thing. Here we are, still here, still gathered, still calling across the distance between the human and the divine. He pulls. The bell sounds, and as the note expands into the still air and begins its slow decay, spreading outward over the empty common and the half-sown fields and the graveyard running beyond its own walls, Father Matthew feels with absolute clarity that each ring marks not only a death but the thinning of something more fundamental, the thread connecting this forsaken patch of earth to the heaven it was built to face. He fears that the echo may soon have no one left to hear it, that the bell will ring into a silence so complete that not even God's ear will seem near enough to catch it. He does not stop ringing, but his hands, when he lets the rope go, are trembling still. And tonight, alone in the rectory with the cooling wax and the worn psalter and the question of faith that will not resolve itself into either shield or lantern, he will press his own palm to his own forehead, in the dark, and close his eyes, and wait to feel what it tells him. This is where the keepers of meaning find themselves, in every age that asks too much of them. Not in triumph, not in revelation, but in a small cold room alone, asking the oldest question, and listening with everything left for an answer that may or may not come. And in the village beyond his window, one door opens in the dark. Someone still moving. Someone choosing, again, not to stop. The market square is empty. Not the emptiness of a Sunday morning, when people are indoors and the quiet is temporary and populated with the sound of voices behind walls, children restless on benches, the scrape of a ladle against an iron pot. This is a different kind of empty, the kind that has settled in and unpacked itself, that has taken up residence in the space between the stalls and spread across the cobblestones like frost that does not melt. A single overturned stall lies on its side near the center, its planks warped from days of rain, the goods it once held long gone or long rotted. It listed. Nobody righted it. Nobody passed close enough to notice, or noticing, cared enough to cross the square and perform that ordinary act of correction that a village performs upon itself 100 times each day, the small continuous maintenance of a community that believes in its own continuation. Once this square smelled of apples and salted herring and fresh rushes strewn over the flagstones on market days, the whole space crackling with the specific energy of commerce and argument and the close warm friction of people who know each other's names conducting the business of staying alive together. Wives fingering bolts of linen in the gray autumn light, testing the weave between finger and thumb the way their mothers taught them. The fishmonger's boy calling prices across the noise. The smell of wood smoke and hot fat from the cookshop, the sour sweetness of cider from the cooper's barrel. All of it gone now. What remains is the sour reek of abandonment, of things left too long in the wrong conditions, of absence fermenting into something almost physical. A faded banner bearing the Lord's crest flaps against a beam at the square's eastern edge, its threads unraveling in the wind that moves through with nothing to obstruct it, the heraldic colors bleached and frayed, the emblem of authority reduced to a rag that cannot decide whether to hold on or let go. But from across the square, through the dark mouth of the forged doorway, comes a sound. Iron on iron. The old, clean note of a hammer finding its mark. Henri the blacksmith is still working. He is the oldest man in St. Allard, which is a distinction that carries more weight than it did 6 months ago, when age was merely age and not a species of improbable survival. He is past 60, a fact remarkable enough in a village where 40 is already late middle age, where the body's accumulated labor tends to present its final accounting well before the biblical measure of years is reached. Henry's body shows its ledger plainly, the hands enlarged by decades of gripping, the shoulders locked into the forward hunch of a man who has spent his life bent over fire and metal, the face seamed and darkened from years of sparks and heat and outdoor cold in alternation. He stokes the coals this morning out of habit, reaching for the bellows the way the body reaches for what it has always reached for, the motion preceding the decision, the muscle knowing before the mind does what the day requires. The bellows wheeze like tired lungs. He does not remark on this. No one comes for horseshoes. No one comes for hinges, for wheel rims, for the repaired plowshares that were once his primary April work, the farmers bringing in the winter's damage as the fields began to soften and the plowing season approached. He waits each morning at the forge anyway, because the forge is where Henri is, has always been, since his father stood him on an upturned bucket at the age of 7 to watch the iron take its first heat, the metal moving from gray to black to deep red to that particular luminous orange that means it is ready to be made into something. He has watched iron take heat for more than 50 years. He is not able to stop, any more than water is able to stop being water. The ring of his hammer echoes too loudly across the empty square. He is aware of this. Each strike travels further than it should, filling the space that the market crowd once absorbed, bouncing off the empty stalls and the shuttered houses and returning to him slightly altered, as though the echo belongs to a different hammer, in a different village, where someone else is working. He strikes again anyway. The sound is defiance of a particular kind, not loud, not theatrical, not aimed at anyone because there is no one to aim it at. It is the defiance of a man who has decided that his work is the proof of his presence, that to stop working is to agree with the silence, and he is not ready to agree with the silence. Henri has lived through famines. There was a winter in his youth when the grain failed 2 years in succession and people ate boiled leather and bark bread and children developed the hollow-eyed stillness that comes before the final stillness. He survived it. He has seen a skirmish with northern raiders, the village men assembled with scythes and billhooks on the roads south of the river, the raiders ultimately deciding that whatever Saint Allard offered was not worth the cost, and he survived that too, with a scar along his left forearm that he still touches sometimes without realizing he is doing it. He has mended plowshares bent by stones. He has crafted the hinges for the chapel door, measuring the iron twice and fitting them with the care of a man who understands that a chapel door must open for a very long time, must serve generations he will not see, and that the quality of his workmanship is therefore a form of promise made to the future. He has never known an enemy he cannot strike. This is the specific bewilderment at the center of Henri's days, not despair, exactly, but a deep and grinding incomprehension, the craftsman's mind confronting a problem that has no physical solution. Every problem Henri has ever faced has had a material answer. The iron is too brittle. Adjust the temperature, adjust the time in the quench. The hinge is misaligned. Refile the eye. The blade is dull. Dress it again and again until the edge returns. There is always something to do with the hands, always a correction the hands can make, and the hands have never failed him when given clear instruction. But this enemy has no surface. It has no iron. It cannot be heated and worked into a different shape. Henri stands at his forge each morning with 50 years of accumulated skill, and the problem he faces does not care about any of it. His wife lies in the churchyard under a simple wooden cross. He carved it himself, in the 2 days between her death and her burial, working the wood in the workshop while the neighbor women sat with her body in the house. His hands were steady throughout. He was not sure they would be. He had felt the tremor in his chest that he did not know how to name, the deep interior shaking that is not grief exactly but the physical registration of a subtraction so large the body takes a moment to understand what has been removed. But the hands were steady. They knew the grain of the wood and the angle of the chisel and the depth of the cut for each letter of her name, and they completed their work while the rest of him shook, and he was grateful to them in the way a man is grateful for anything reliable in an unreliable time. He does not visit the cross every day. He passes it sometimes on his way to the well, and he looks at it with the particular expression of a man who has decided that sentiment is a luxury he cannot afford while there is still work remaining, while the fire still needs stoking and the hammer still needs lifting and the square still needs the sound of iron to prove that something in Saint Allard has not yet gone quiet. The travelers have stopped coming. The road toward the river, once worn to pale mud by the feet of merchants and pilgrims and journeymen moving between markets, has begun to grass over, the verges creeping inward, the ruts filling with water that has nowhere urgent to be. Rumor still arrives, carried by the occasional rider who passes without stopping, calling news from the saddle the way one drops a stone into water and rides on before the ripples reach the bank. Henri has heard tales of entire towns emptied in a fortnight, not the slow attrition of Saint Allard but a sudden total erasure, the living departing ahead of the dying until the town is left to complete its dying alone. He has heard of ships found drifting in harbor mouths with no living hand aboard, cargo intact, sails set, as though the crew simply stepped off the edge of the world between one port and the next. He has heard of physicians in great cities wearing long robes and gloves of waxed cloth and masks shaped like a bird's beak, the beak stuffed with aromatic herbs, lavender, camphor, clove, on the theory that corrupted air could be filtered through the right combination of scent, the pestilence fooled or repelled by the smell of something alive and green. Henri cannot picture such a costume. He tries, standing at the forge with the hammer at rest, and finds the image unreachable, too distant from anything his world has contained. But he understands, with the quiet clarity of a man who has spent his life solving problems, the desperation that would birth such a thing. The reaching toward any instrument, however improbable. The refusal to stand empty-handed before something that is killing you. He picks the hammer back up. Sparks leap from the iron into the dim light of the forge, brief constellations blazing for a quarter second before vanishing, too quick and too small to survive the distance between the anvil and the floor. Henri watches them sometimes, these small extinctions, repeated 100 times each working day for 50 years, and has never until now found them remarkable. Now he watches each spark complete its arc and disappear, and thinks about brightness and brevity and the question of whether a thing needs to last to matter. The spark is real while it burns. The iron remembers the heat even after the heat is gone. On the wall of his workshop hangs a ring of keys. He forged them over the course of 30 years, each one made for a specific door in Saint Allard at the request of a specific person. The Reeves strongbox key, the wide old key for the millhouse lock, the small precise key for the box where the chandler kept his accounts. Many of those doors now stand ajar. Some stand forever closed, their owners past the need of locks, past the need of anything a blacksmith can make. The keys hang in a ring and catch the light from the forge, turning slightly when the draft moves through, their iron worn bright at the bow from the hands that held them. Henri looks at them sometimes and does not say what he is thinking. As dusk settles over the empty square, settling the way dusk always settles, unhurried, indifferent, spreading from the east with the patience of something that has been doing this since before any human village existed to receive it, Henri quenches a blade in a bucket of water. The iron hisses, a sound like whispered prayers compacted into a single syllable, steam rising briefly above the rim and vanishing. He holds the blade in the cooling water and waits, as he has always waited, for the metal to tell him through the handle when it has finished. He has learned to read iron through his hands. He has learned to read most things through his hands. He looks toward the chapel tower. The bell comes a moment later, that single, spreading note that has marked the death of someone in Saint Allard since before Henri was born, that will mark deaths long after Henri himself no longer hears it. He bows his head, a gesture that is not quite prayer and not quite grief but something older than either, the acknowledgement that a life has ended, made by a living body in the language available to it. Soot streaks his forehead where he has pressed the back of his hand against his brow in the heat of the afternoon. In the candlelight of the forge, it looks like the ash mark of a funeral rite, the old sign pressed into skin to say, "You are dust, and to dust you shall return." He did not intend it. The body sometimes knows things before the mind does. He wonders how long iron can endure when flesh fails so easily. He has made things that will outlast him by centuries. The chapel hinges will still be swinging when the names of everyone in this village have been forgotten, when the parchment rolls rot and the wooden crosses weather to nothing and even the stone of the graveyard wall rounds and softens. Iron is patient in a way that living things are not. It does not feel the cold. It does not long for anything. It simply endures, carrying the shape it was given, until something harder changes it. And yet it is not iron that he misses, standing in the doorway of the forge as the last light fails and the square absorbs the dark. It is not iron he carved the name into. It is not iron that rose before the bell each morning to carry water to the houses of the dying. It is not iron that knelt on a cold floor and held a hand and did not let go. The question he cannot answer, the one that stays with him as he banks the coals and lifts his coat and steps out into the evening, is whether any of it will be remembered. Whether the hammer's sound, crossing the empty square morning after morning into silence, is a mark being made on something. Whether the endurance of the living, the sheer unremarkable fact of continuing, constitutes a kind of inscription. Whether the village, in its diminished and suffering state, is writing something on the world that the world will not immediately forget. Across the square, a light appears in a window. Someone's still awake. Someone's still burning their tallow against the dark. Henri stops and looks at it for a moment. That small, warm, utterly ordinary rectangle of yellow light in the wall of a house that is still inhabited, still tended, still inhabited by a person who has not given up on the idea of light. He goes home. He will be back at the forge at dawn. And across the village, in a house he does not know, a young woman who has buried her mother and risen anyway is considering the same darkness, the same diminishing of everything she was given to expect from the world, and beginning, slowly, to ask what might be built from what remains. The rain has been falling for 3 days without pause or apology. Not the dramatic rain of storms, which at least carries the dignity of violence, which announces itself with thunder and retreats when it has made its point. This rain is patient and gray and completely indifferent, falling with the steady persistence of something that has forgotten it was ever anything else, turning the lanes of St. Allard into rivulets of brown water that swallow footprints as soon as they are made. Each boot print fills and smooths and disappears, as though the ground is quietly erasing the evidence of the living, reclaiming the impressions left by weight and movement and returning everything to an unmarked surface. The thatch roofs sag beneath the accumulation, the eaves weeping in thin streams onto doorsteps where no one stands to sweep them clean. The gutters overflow. The water finds its own paths through the village, running in channels between cobblestones, pooling in the low places, taking what gravity offers and going where it is invited. The air smells of wet wool and decay, and the faint sweetness of crushed apples left too long in their baskets. That particular sweetness that is 1 degree removed from rot, which the body registers as pleasant for a moment before understanding what it is actually smelling. Somewhere in the middle distance, a shutter bangs against a wall in an irregular rhythm, answering the wind, answering and receiving nothing back. Inside a cottage at the edge of the fields, a boy named Tomlin sits beside a shuttered window. He is tracing patterns in the condensation with one thin finger, spirals, mostly, and then straight lines cutting through the spirals, and then the letters of his own name, which his mother taught him 3 winters ago using a stick in the ash of the hearth floor, making him copy each letter until his hand remembered the shapes without being told. He traces it now in the moisture on the shutter boards and watches the letters blur and run before they are finished, the water reclaiming them, and he does not know why he keeps making them anyway. Perhaps for the same reason Henri strikes the iron. Perhaps because making your name is a form of insisting that you have one. He is 12 years old. He is old enough to remember the harvest dances, the way the barn looked in October with the lanterns hung from the beams and the cider flowing from the cooper's barrel, the whole village pressed together in the warm animal closeness of people who have worked a long year together and are now celebrating the fact of its completion. He is old enough to remember his father's laugh, which came from low in the chest and arrived without warning at unexpected things, at a dog's behavior or a neighbor's joke told badly, the laugh always larger than the occasion seemed to require. He is old enough to remember his mother's hands in bread dough, the particular motion of her wrists, the way she'd press her flower-white forearm to her forehead when she straightened up from the table, leaving a pale ghost of herself on her own skin. He remembers mostly the silence now. His father went first, in the 2nd week of February, the fever moving through him like a fire through a dry barn. Fast, total, consuming everything in sequence. He raved in the final days, speaking of things that were not in the room, his eyes fixed on a middle distance that Tomlin could not locate. He spoke of angels with black wings, which the priest later told Tomlin should be understood as a vision of holy messengers, as comfort, as the soul preparing for its crossing. Tomlin listened to this explanation and thanked the priest for it and did not entirely believe it. The expression on his father's face during those visions was not the expression of a man receiving comfort. His mother followed within a fortnight, her dying quieter than her husband's, as though she had observed how it was done and resolved to do it differently, less sound, more stillness, a slow withdrawal rather than a burning. She held Tomlin's hand on the last morning with a grip that was still, even then, stronger than he expected, and then the grip loosened, and the hand was just a hand. The neighbors who might have taken him in are gone or afraid, those two conditions having become nearly identical. He has learned to be undemanding in his needs, to make himself small and sustainable, to turn the contents of the cottage's remaining stores into a problem of arithmetic, this many dried peas divided by this many days, this heel of rye bread portioned into this many fragments, each fragment eaten slowly and with attention, the way a person eats when eating has become an act of deliberate continuation rather than pleasure. He rations each bite as though counting beads on a rosary, assigning to each small act of sustenance the weight and intentionality of prayer. Perhaps it is prayer. Perhaps survival, at its most stripped and essential, is a form of the same thing. From time to time, men ride past on the road beyond the palisade. They come from neighboring manors, faces covered in the manner that has become universal, linen scarves, leather masks, the precautions of people who have accepted that the air itself cannot be trusted. They call out from their horses without dismounting, their voices muffled and slightly distorted by the cloth, carrying offers of coin for labor in the fields to the east and south, where workers have died in numbers that have left the harvest unguaranteed and the lords who own the land in a state of unprecedented anxiety. The wages they offer are unheard of. 3 times, 4 times the old rate. Numbers that would have been spoken in whispers a year ago, almost embarrassing in their generosity, as though the Lord's purse had been suddenly and forcibly opened by the pressure of necessity. Tomlin listens from behind the shuttered window. He has heard the serfs talking, in the careful low voices of people discussing dangerous ideas, that the old bindings are loosening, that the plague has done what no petition or rebellion managed, that a lord cannot bind a serf who is no longer there to be bound, that a man who walks away from his holding into the labor-starved lands beyond the manor boundary will find, for the first time in the history of his family's service, that someone is waiting to receive him, that his work has acquired, in the catastrophe of so much death, something it never possessed before. Value. They say it quietly, these whispers, because even now the habit of caution is deep and the fear of what authority can do to those who test it has not entirely released its grip. The old world is loosening, but it has not yet let go, and between loosening and release is a distance that can break a man who misjudges it. Tomlin hears these conversations and turns them over in his mind, examining them the way he examines everything now, carefully, from multiple angles, testing for the crack that would let grief or hope in too quickly. Freedom, he has begun to understand, tastes different than he would have imagined. It tastes like graves. Like the specific freedom of having nothing left to lose because the things that made loss meaningful are already gone. His father's laugh is in a trench beyond the churchyard wall. His mother's hands are stilled. The village that would have held him in its structures and its expectations and its obligations, that web of belonging within which a boy like Tomlin would have known exactly who he was and what was required of him and where he fit in the long continuity of his family's place in this particular patch of earth, that village is a diminished and uncertain thing now, more absence than presence, more memory than community. He is free in the way that something cut loose is free, which includes the terror of having no anchor and nowhere particular to fall. At night he listens to the drip of rain coming through a gap in the thatch above the loft. A thin, irregular percussion, each drop landing in the same place on the earthen floor, slowly deepening its small crater. He has begun to imagine the village as a ship, which is a thing he has never seen but has heard described by a tinker who passed through 3 summers ago, a vessel taking on water through 100 small breaches, each cottage another place where the sea is getting in, each death another gap in the hull, and the water rising with the patient indifference of water everywhere, without malice, without intention, simply occupying the space it is given. In the loft above him, sacks of barley lie split open, the grain scattered across the boards like sand in an hourglass that has been knocked on its side. Time itself feels altered these months, stretched thin between one tolling of the bell and the next, the hours losing their ordinary texture, the days becoming difficult to distinguish from one another in the absence of the rhythms that once structured them: the market day, the feast day, the plowing, the sowing, the reaping, the repetition that is not monotony but meaning, the proof that the seasons still turn and that human life is woven into their turning. Without that weaving, time becomes strange. One morning, a morning that begins like every other morning, with the gray light coming through the shutter cracks and the drip and the cold and the question of whether to rise, Tomlin opens the door. He does not make a decision, exactly. The door opens. His feet find the step. The rain has slowed to a thin mist overnight, the air carrying it now in suspension rather than falling it, and the world outside is gray and very still and smells of wet earth and the indefinite sweetness of early spring pressing up through the cold. The fields beyond the palisade are empty, mist curling low over the furrows in long slow scrolls, the turned earth dark and patient, waiting for seed that may or may not come from hands that may or may not still be here to plant it. He stands in the doorway for a moment, neither inside nor outside. He does not know, in this moment, whether he is walking towards something or away from something. He does not know if the road ahead leads to survival or simply to more distance between himself and the place where his name was made and his parents' hands were real and the barns smelled of cider and warmth and the ordinary holiness of people gathered together in celebration of having endured. He does not know what walking away will cost him, or what staying will cost him, or whether cost is even the right measure for a decision like this. Behind him, the village crouches in the gray light. A cluster of timber and thatch and sorrow, the chapel tower rising above the roof lines, the bell rope waiting in the dark inside it. The forge where iron still rings. The well where a rope still hangs. The graves, where the names are or are not marked, where the people who made him who he is are becoming, slowly, part of the ground. Ahead, the road gleams with rain and with uncertainty, stretching toward a horizon that this morning offers no promise except the bare fact of its existence, that there is a beyond, that the world does not end at the palisade, that somewhere past the mist the land continues and other people are in it and some of them are still building fires and drawing water and making the small insistent gestures of continuation. Tomlin steps off the threshold, and in that fragile crossing, between boyhood and a world undone, between the village that formed him and the road that has not yet told him what it will require, something stirs. Not hope exactly, not yet. Hope requires a destination, and he does not have one. But something older than hope, something that precedes it and makes it possible, the sheer animal insistence on the next step, the refusal of the feet to stop, the body's ancient argument against stillness. He is 12 years old. He has buried his parents with his own hands. He does not know where the road goes. He walks. And behind him, in the cottage he has left with the door standing open to the rain, the condensation on the shuttered windows still holds the ghost of his name, already blurring, already beginning to run, but for this one moment still there, still legible, still insisting on itself against the slow erasure of water and time and forgetting. The world he is walking into will not be the world that made him. It will be harder and stranger and emptier of the things that made life feel like life. But it will also be, and this is the terrible, fragile, extraordinary truth at the center of everything that is about to happen, still a world. Still turning. Still capable, against all the evidence of these months of death and silence and bells tolling into empty air, of receiving a boy who walks into it with nothing but the willingness to walk. The story of what remains is only beginning. And it begins, as such stories always begin, with a single pair of feet finding the road in the gray morning light, and moving.